Winning actor Gene Hackman's out of the hospital after an accident in the Florida Keys. The 81-year-old was riding his bike.
Our officers got a call from a homeless male who said he had just been beat up by Gene Hackman.
What do you think a 94-year-old retired movie star is up to these days? Playing golf? Relaxing on a beach? Well, if you're talking about Gene Hackman, you're way off.
He's just a little bit slower than he used to be. I just reached my peak.
This guy has been brawling with strangers, surviving truck accidents, and cycling like he's training for the Tour de France. Also, there's a reason he turned his back on Hollywood and a secret sadness behind the tough guy exterior. This is the Gene Hackman story you never knew you needed.
I started in the theater. I did 7 Broadway plays, all of them comedy. Light comedy. They wouldn't allow them these days. I never had any large goals, or all I wanted to do was work. I loved it so much.
Gene Hackman was born back in 1930 in a place called San Bernardino, California. Things weren't exactly stable for Gene growing up. His dad, who worked printing newspapers, kept moving the family around for different jobs. On top of that, his parents just didn't get along. It sounds like things were pretty rough at home, with Gene's dad beating both his mom and him. Then when Gene was just a teenager, 13 to be exact, everything changed. His dad basically said goodbye and drove away, leaving Gene and his mom behind. Gene never saw his father again. This was a huge deal for Gene, something he carried with him for years and years. He even said once that when he had to act all emotional in movies, he'd remember that day his dad left. After his dad disappeared, Gene and his mom moved to Danville, Illinois, where they lived with Grandma. Gene wasn't exactly a model student back then. School bored him, and instead of doing homework, he'd rather make mischief. He was always clashing with teachers and anyone telling him what to do. It seems like that whole authority thing just didn't sit well with young Gene, and that attitude never really left him. Gene got into trouble too. Remember, this was a kid without much direction. Getting caught stealing food landed him in jail for a bit. His poor mom tried her best, but Gene was a handful. The only time he ever truly settled down was at the movies. His mom watched him light up watching films, always saying she hoped he'd be a famous actor someday. Sadly, she wouldn't live long enough to see her dream for Gene come true. Tired of school and that whole rule-following thing, Gene got into a fight with a coach and dropped out at just 16. Jobs didn't work out so well, he bounced around, never sticking with anything. Then, Gene made a wild decision. At the age of 16, he decided to join U.S. Marine Corps to have financial stability and get out of messy home life. He was underage, but he lied about it. It was right after World War II ended, so the military wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was a chance for adventure, and maybe more importantly, a way to get away and find some structure. Boot camp in San Diego, that must have been a shock. Marines are all about discipline, orders, and doing what you're told. You can bet that didn't go over too well with Gene, especially after his whole rebel-without-a-cause teenage years. He even admitted later that authority figures were still a problem. Fights with other guys got him in trouble a lot. After boot camp, Gene spent some time at Camp Pendleton, California, learning the ropes of a field radio operator. Being in charge of all those radios and communications sounds really important. That job took him all over the globe, even to China during the revolution under Mao. Imagine the wild stuff he must have seen. But then, boom, the Korean War broke out in 1950, and it was time for Gene to serve his nation. Just when they needed him in Korea, Gene's wild side kicked in again. He crashed his motorcycle into a tractor and broke a whole bunch of bones. Talk about bad timing. But in a way, it was lucky. He got out of being shipped off to a war zone. Instead, Gene spent the rest of his military days spinning records as a disc jockey for the base's radio station. Being a DJ might not sound all that exciting, but it actually did Gene a big favor. He got to practice his voice and work on his delivery, things that would become super important once he started acting. In 1952, Gene got out of the Marines with an honorable discharge. Sure, the military wasn't always easy for him, but think about it. It took him away from his messy hometown and gave him experiences he never would have had otherwise. Plus, it was probably the first bit of real stability he'd ever known. Leaving the Marines behind, Gene hit New York City with a new dream. He figured he'd use the GI Bill, study journalism at the University of Illinois, and start a whole new chapter. Well, that lasted about 6 months before Gene decided it wasn't for him. So back to the original plan acting. But New York wasn't exactly welcoming him with open arms. Forget getting roles. Gene couldn't even land a steady gig. He sold stuff door to door, moved furniture, basically whatever he could to pay the bills. By the time he was 26, life looked pretty bleak. Gene felt like he'd flunked out at everything. But true to his nature, he wasn't about to go down without a fight. In 1956, he packed his bags for California and gave it one last shot at the fame he always dreamed of. This time he went to the famous Pasadena Playhouse, a place known for turning out serious actors. Even there, it was rough. He picked fights like he did in the Marines, and guess what? He made a new buddy, another rebel named Dustin Hoffman, who was only 19 at the time. These two were something else. The class voted them least likely to succeed. They hated the whole scene but stuck together, eventually becoming lifelong friends. The two moved in together and were soon joined by another aspiring actor, Robert Duvall. The three shared apartments together for years, which certainly would have made for an interesting sitcom. California wasn't exactly sunshine and roses either. The Pasadena Playhouse was tough, and despite his best shot, Gene clashed again, just like in the Marines. This time it got him kicked out after a year, but Gene wasn't about to give up on his dream. He kept grinding, taking any acting gigs he could find, mostly off-Broadway plays. All that hard work started to pay off. In 1961, he landed his first real film role in Mad Dog Call. Small parts followed, like in the TV series Tallahassee 7000. At 31, things were finally looking up. Then, life threw another curveball. In 1962, Gene Hackman's mother lit a cigarette and then fell asleep after drinking too much. Tragically, the cigarette ended up setting fire to her home, and she did not manage to escape. With his father gone, his mother was all Gene had left from his family, and now she was gone too. This left him heartbroken, and he later admitted that he was devastated that his mother was not able to ever see him act in person or make it big. Despite the crushing loss of his mom, Gene kept pushing forward with his dream. Things started moving when he landed a role alongside Warren Beatty back in 1964. That connection would be huge because Beatty liked working with Gene and recommended him for the part of Buck Barrow in the iconic film Bonnie and Clyde in 1967. That role was a breakout. Gene scored an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and suddenly everyone in Hollywood knew his name. He wasn't about to slow down. The 1970s were a whirlwind of great roles for Gene, including his legendary turn as Popeye Doyle in The French Connection, 1971. Word is, he got so deep into that character, so committed to making it real, that he clashed with director William Friedkin on set. They'd go at it, but you can't argue with the results. That performance was unforgettable and won Gene an Academy Award for Best Actor. The hits kept coming for Gene in the 1970s. He teamed up with another rising star, Al Pacino, in the movie Scarecrow in 1973. Again, there were on-set tensions with Gene and Al Pacino having very different working styles. Gene was all about planning and taking things seriously, while Al was more go-with-the-flow and emotional. Some folks even thought Gene could be a bit intense and argumentative. Despite the behind-the-scenes drama, nobody could deny Gene's talent. He could play anything: action heroes, dramatic characters, you name it. He starred in a mix of genres, from thrillers like The Conversation, 1974, which garnered critical acclaim and further award nominations to war films and westerns. Gene wasn't just killing it in indie flicks either. His role as the iconic villain Lex Luthor in Superman, 1978, showed he could totally own blockbuster movies too, playing both serious and straight-up bad guy roles with equal power. But life beyond the cameras wasn't always easy in the 70s and 80s. Gene lost his best buddy, Norman Gary, in 1982, which was a major blow. Around the same time, his 30-year marriage to Faye Maltese was falling apart. They had 3 kids together, but with Gene constantly away filming, being a family man just wasn't working. The divorce in 1986 took a toll. Years later, Gene owned up, telling the New York Times that it was his fault. He said, "You spend all those years desperate for recognition, then when the work comes, it's hard to say no." Gene even admitted in a GQ interview that all the traveling for movies meant he'd lost contact with his kids for a time. Things got tight for Gene financially around this time. Tax problems, some bad investments. Suddenly he couldn't afford the high-rolling lifestyle anymore. He even had to borrow his daughter's car. This meant hustling, taking way more film roles than he might have liked just to keep the money flowing. From 1985 to 1988, he cranked out a whopping 9 movies. One of those roles, in Mississippi Burning, 1988, finally brought his career roaring back to life. He played an FBI agent digging into some dark stuff, and the critics loved it, scoring him his second Best Actor Oscar nomination. Thing is, even on this serious film, there's that old story of Gene being hard to work with. He got so wrapped up in making things feel real that he clashed with the director, Alan Parker. Everyone had to deal with Gene's strong opinions on how scenes should go down. Directors want the movie their way, and Gene, well, let's just say he wasn't about to shy away from giving his input. In 1992, he teamed up with Clint Eastwood for Unforgiven and played the chilling bad guy, Little Bill Daggett. That performance nabbed him another Academy Award and proved he was one of Hollywood's all-time greats. He just kept working, taking on a huge range of roles, comedies, dramas, everything. His role in The Royal Tenenbaums, 2001, as Royal Tenenbaum, was critically acclaimed, showing his range by moving into more quirky, character-driven films. However, on the set, Gene got into numerous arguments with the director, Wes Anderson, over the direction of the film. His co-star Bill Murray reportedly stepped in to mediate tensions on set, providing a buffer between Gene and others. Gene's final film role came in the 2004 film Welcome to Mooseport. However, the film was a box office flop, spending $30 million in budget but only generating $14 million in box office revenue. After this flop, Gene announced his retirement and has not acted since. Since his retirement, the legend of Gene's nature has only grown. He has proved that he did not just play a tough guy, but that he is, in fact, a tough guy in real life too. Even out of Hollywood, Gene never lost that tough guy edge. In 2001, at 71 years old, he was driving in West Hollywood when he had a little fender bender. Some young guys in the other car jumped out, getting all up in his face and yelling at him. Now, most folks that age might take it, but not Gene. Witnesses say it went on for a bit before something those guys said set him off. 71 or not, Gene went after them. They actually managed to tackle him and hold him down until the cops showed up. Turns out no one wanted to press charges, but man, talk about a headline. That wasn't the last time either. In 2012, Gene was 82, walking in Santa Fe with his wife Betsy. A homeless man hassles them, insulting Betsy, and Gene wasn't having it in any way whatsoever. He stood up for himself and his wife, and once again the cops rolled in. But this time, they cleared him total self-defense. What makes this even wilder is that in his older years, Gene had some serious health problems. Yet he still wasn't afraid to throw down if he had to. Speaking of health issues, in 1990, things got scary when he had symptoms that pointed to prostate cancer. He went under the knife, but thankfully it turned out to be a false alarm. That same year, though, more danger came knocking. Doctors found serious blockages in his arteries, putting him at major risk. They did an angioplasty, think of it like inflating a tiny balloon to open things back up. His wife was told he might not have made it much longer if they hadn't caught it. Talk about a close call. Sadly, those heart problems weren't over. In the early 2000s, they flared up again, and this time, Gene knew it was time to slow down. This was a huge part of why he retired. The stress of acting, the crazy schedules, it was too much for his health. But it wasn't just his heart. In 2004, Gene got seriously banged up in a bicycle accident in Florida. Head injuries, all sorts of stuff. Even that didn't fully stop him. He kept riding his bike well into his 80s, showing he was determined to stay active and enjoy life even with those health hurdles. Even accidents couldn't stop Gene from staying active. In 2012, Gene was not wearing a helmet when he was cycling and was hit by a truck. Luckily, he wasn't seriously hurt and managed to bounce back. Fast forward to 2018, and Gene, at 88 years old, wasn't slowing down. He went and bought an e-bike. He was all about keeping those legs moving. Living in Santa Fe, New Mexico definitely helped. It's got great weather, tons of trails, perfect for a guy who loves to get outdoors. Those trails in the New Mexico desert were his playground, and he'd take off on his bike to explore. You might remember seeing Gene in all those tough guy roles. He always looked strong, and he didn't let that slip, even as he got older. Staying in shape, especially at his age, makes a huge difference for those health issues he faced. Gene Hackman always brought that tough guy edge to his movie roles, so it makes perfect sense that he was a speed demon off-screen too. He raced cars for years, competing with the Sports Car Club of America. It wasn't just for show, this was serious business. Gene trained hard and put in the hours to be competitive, showcasing the same dedication he brought to his acting. In fact, back in 1986, he had a bad crash during an endurance race, rolling his car. Thankfully, he walked away from it. That kind of risk-taking, that competitive drive, it was very Gene Hackman, whether he was acting or racing. Gene's love for the sport went beyond just driving. He even co-authored a novel about his experiences on the track, proving his passion wasn't a casual hobby. Of course, with age, Gene's days behind the wheel have slowed down, but the excitement is still there. He'll watch races, keep up with all the racing news, and stay connected to the community. Even if he's not out there tearing up the track himself, that fire for racing will always be part of who he is. Gene may have had a few movie flops along the way, but he insists that's not why he retired in 2004. It was more about his health. All those heart issues caught up with him, and just wanting a change of pace. It was time to try new things, enjoy a quieter life away from the Hollywood craziness. And in true Gene Hackman style, his exit was low-key. No big announcements or farewell tours. That fits, considering he's always been a more private guy, happier out of the spotlight. Since retiring, he hasn't been twiddling his thumbs. Turns out, Gene's always been a writer at heart. He's co-authored several novels, some historical fiction, even political thrillers. Shows how he's still got that creative fire burning, just in a different form now. He even told Reuters, "I like the loneliness of writing. It's similar in some ways to acting, but it's more private." Leaving Hollywood behind, Gene found a new haven in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The sun-baked landscapes and peaceful atmosphere provided the perfect backdrop for a new chapter in his life. It wasn't just beautiful. Santa Fe offered the privacy Gene craved. Here he could write in solitude, focusing on his latest novel without the glare of the spotlight. But writing wasn't his only pursuit. His love for the outdoors continued to flourish. He explored the scenic trails on his bike, keeping himself active well into his golden years. There was even a new creative outlet: painting. It seems Gene's artistic side wasn't limited to just acting. Perhaps most importantly, Gene reconnected with his family. Having admitted regret over missing out on time with his children earlier in life, he now cherished spending time with them. He even came out of retirement briefly to narrate documentaries about the Marine Corps, where he once served. But after that, Hollywood's allure couldn't compete with the peace of Santa Fe. He retired again. Public appearances became a rarity, though sometimes you might catch a glimpse of him with his wife, Betsy Arakawa. They married in 1991, and she's been a constant presence in his life ever since. A classically trained pianist and former owner of a home furnishing store, Betsy shared Gene's love for the arts and a quiet life. Theirs seems to be a relationship built on mutual respect and shared passions. Gene Hackman, the guy who played so many tough-as-nails, take-no-prisoners roles, turns out he's not like that at all in real life. Off-screen, he's famously private and laid back, the complete opposite of the Hollywood scene. He's described as soft-spoken, even gentle, which is a wild contrast to the characters he brought to life in movies like The French Connection or Crimson Tide. The thing is, Gene's a bit of a paradox. That gentle side exists, but don't mistake it for weakness. Remember all those stories about him clashing with directors? Or defending himself from those guys on the street, even in his old age? There's still fire in there, a willingness to fight back and not be pushed around. That's the thing about Gene, he's complicated and way more than just the tough guy roles he made famous. You know how some actors get caught up in the whole fame thing? Gene wasn't about that at all. He didn't want to walk red carpets or give flashy interviews. His focus was always on the work, the craft of acting. And though he was known for playing serious, intense characters, don't let that fool you. Off-set, he had a great sense of humor. His co-stars would talk about how he'd lighten the mood, cracking jokes when things got tense. He had this playful side the cameras didn't always catch. But here's another surprise. Gene's a total bookworm. He loves to read, especially history. That love for the past even shaped his life after acting. Gene started writing historical fiction novels, co-authoring them with an archaeologist named Daniel Lenihan. Those books aren't just fluff. Gene takes the research seriously, digging deep to make them feel authentic. It just shows how much more there is to Gene Hackman than those gruff take-charge roles on the big screen. Think of those classic Gene Hackman roles. He's always got that stoic, nothing can shake me look. But turns out the man himself is way more complex than that. He's been open about the tough stuff he faced growing up, his family moving a lot, money problems, and worst of all, his dad taking off and never being around. You can imagine how that would shape a person, and it shows there's a lot of emotional depth that Gene may be channeled into his acting. He's not afraid to be vulnerable when talking about this stuff. You can genuinely see the pain when he talks about his mom and how she never got to see him succeed, or his own regrets about not being there as a father when his kids were young. It's a whole different side of Gene Hackman, proving that despite the tough guy image, both on screen and in some of those real-life stories, there's a deep well of feeling underneath the surface.